Well, I might just get the ball rolling before throwing the mic open to the crowd. I hope I'm not going to lower the tone of the event, but I've got a sort of cynical question to start with for the panellists, and that really emerges from some of the Commonwealth rhetoric that's to be found around the white paper process. As we've, some of the speakers already alluded to, there's some discussion in the white paper process about the states should be sovereign in their own sphere and lining up lines of political accountability so that financial responsibility lines up with political responsibility and having some nice neat lines like that. I suppose my question is whether we should be cynical about the timing of the federalism white paper process together with the taxation white paper process, and what's really driving what. What's really happening is the Commonwealth is hoping that with this new responsibility will come state financial contribution, and if that's the case, then will the advances that might be made in federalism be wound back when the money starts to flow again and the Commonwealth finds itself in a better financial position?
This sounds a very political point of view being put forward by an officer of state government, and I think I will be a good angel and not tread in this territory. I think we're entitled to take the federal move on its face. I would think the federal government does see the discordancies that are made clear in the CEDA discussion paper, and therefore something ought to be done about it. There is a comment in the paper that it does seem a bit odd to be talking about a new federalism or a new approach to federal arrangements under white paper process at the very time when the Reform Committee has been abolished by the present federal government. But maybe that abolition has been done in order that they can set up their own Federation Council, such as is proposed in the paper, and maybe that's the way they'll go ahead. But I don't think one should jump in and criticise something the full scope of which we don't yet know and won't know until the white paper comes up next year, and that would be time enough for a state officer looking at it from a state background to get into the usual cynical sort of debates we have in Australia. I thought that Lynn made a very good point about those boomerangs, you know, that we've got, that there is an argument for the Federation that needs to be emphasised, which is not purely economic. It's cultural, and it's about the nature and diversity of our country. And another good point made in the document, which I think was important, was that a value of federation is that it allows more accountability close to the delivery of services, and that is good for democracy. And there are arguments in the document which are not purely economic arguments. They're about your notion of what Australia, what Project Australia, what Team Australia is really about. And I think if we could lift the debate to that sort of level, we might well make some progress, and even across party and federal, state, territory and local government differences.
I'd just add to the fact that if we are going to a wide community debate on issues of federation, then there will be a multiplicity of viewpoints that need to come out in that debate if we really are to have a full discussion on all the issues. And so different stakeholders in that debate may well come at from a point of view of either altruistic self-interest or disingenuous self-interest, but that's going to be the way it's going to be. But contributions like this of CEDA's and I would hope of other organisations in our community will help us have a full debate of all these points of view being able to take into account. And then from that, we'll end up leaving the room thinking differently to how we entered it, to use Neil Andrews' reference.
I think the Prime Minister's commitment is genuine, and I've watched him make the transition from let's abolish the states, which he wrote in Battle Lines, to becoming a federalist, and you can see that journey he's been on. I don't think maybe his cabinet colleagues have been on that journey and probably don't understand as yet the far-reaching implications of the reform that he's starting to put out there through the white paper process. So I think there's a lot of political choppy waters, but the Prime Minister does have on his side the Liberal state premiers as colleagues who are constantly in his ear about the need for this reform.
Okay. Can we agree that we will drop the words the sovereign powers of the states? In a federal system, none of the units is truly sovereign. This is very 19th century English notions that Parliament can make a person who's red-haired a blonde-haired. There are no parliaments of that kind and no governments of that kind in the Australian Commonwealth. All of them have lost some of their so-called sovereignty in order to be a part of the federal system. Nothing in Australia is supreme and total power. Everything is under the Constitution. Everything is subject to the law, and therefore talk of sovereign is a little bit misleading. Even in the international sphere, North Korea goes on endlessly about the sovereign power of North Korea to do what it likes to its people. But once you join the international system, once you sign up to the Charter, once you sign, as they have, many Universal Declaration and other documents, they've endorsed the Declaration, they've signed many treaties, then you are no longer totally sovereign. And that's just a part of the modern world, that to live together in peace and security and respecting agreed fundamental values, we all agree that none of us claim to be totally sovereign. It's a 19th century English Parliament notion, and we've got to get it out of our thinking.
Are there any questions from the floor? If you could announce your name and your organisation, that'd be great.
Philip Taylor from State Development. I've been struck by the capacity of the Scandinavians who seem to thrive partly on the basis of their ability to achieve consensus on a range of things. And I wonder whether in the Anglo-Saxon world our adversarial legal and political systems are a problem, whether other forms of those systems would be better for the cultural change that you've referred to.
I don't know that I'd necessarily agree with the premise. If you look at the recent very sharp electoral debates in Sweden and in Scandinavia, they're also, especially about matters of race, they have similar difficulties to other modern societies in getting enough consensus for working democracy. But they muddle through and they generally get there, as we do too. I think the combative nature of media today, and in particular the growth of media with an agenda, instead of being chroniclers of the issues in our country and the debates that are played out by politicians and other leaders, intellectual and other leaders, we now see journalists who are personalities in their own right. They have their byline, they have their photograph, they have their opinions. We have mixed up fact and opinion, the disgraced so-and-so. The citizens aren't allowed to judge whether a person is disgraced. They're told it by a journalist. This is a feature that's come in a highly combative journalistic style, which I don't know how we can get away from it, but it is not conducive to serious discussion. And the type of discussion we have in the CEDA document will get nowhere in that type of environment. I do think CEDA has to give a lot of thought to how it can get this document much simpler and much briefer, and at a level of understanding that school children and educated and ordinary citizens can grapple with the issues, because otherwise it will not become a popular idea and it'll go nowhere. It'll have hostility because people will be out for the dispute. I'm waiting for the weekend's newspapers to see how Mr. Whitlam's memorial service will be dealt with in due course, whether there will now be some shocking revelations or something outrageous to drag people down. That's another feature of the world we live in, and it's not conducive to the compromises that are necessary in a democracy.
It might actually be very interesting that you brought in the media into this, because what we do have in this country is the opposite of a kind of federation. We have a unitary central state for most part, for a large section of our print media certainly. And if we had more vibrancy of a federal interactive process in our media structure, we might end up with a somewhat different outcome. And maybe things like social media in the end will help provide the counterbalance to that. But just returning to the premise at the outset, I actually am a great believer, and it's not simply because I'm defensive about how I spent 15 years of my life. I'm a great believer in the creative tension of ideas that is offered by our parliamentary system. The pitting of Her Majesty's loyal opposition against Her Majesty's government is to my mind an essential process. Yes, the creative tension of ideas often collapses into the destructive tension of ideas, but I'm not sure that the absence of the creative tension gets us very far. You mentioned Scandinavia. In fact, there is quite a vibrant degree of creative tension of ideas takes place in their parliamentary systems. Perhaps the real analogy we need to compare with is the Swiss system, where there is substantially less because there has been essentially a coalition of the major power holders on all sides of politics for a long time. And I think that has been a force for lack of change, not a force in favour of change.
But Lynn, don't you think that the very important feature of parliamentary democracy today is the radical decline in citizen membership of political parties?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
And citizens are staying away in droves
Yes.
from the local Labor Party or Liberal Party or the other parties in our country, and so that relatively few citizens are choosing the local member, and the local members choose the cabinet, and the cabinet chooses the leader of government, and all of this has really now reduced to an extremely small pool of very dedicated people who will go along to the beer and prawn night and put up with all the tedious features of political life, and then be assailed constantly and lose their privacy in the way media plays out today. I think this is a really important
You're absolutely right.
feature.
At the risk of being seen as a grumpy ex-politician, I think
don't let that stop you.
The way that has come about with what I would say in an extreme sense, apparatchiks taking more and more control of the major parties in our system
And
is
staff.
a major cost to us, a major cost to our democratic system. But it doesn't take away from the principles that we have a model that potentially can work better.
I might just add to that. What I see has happened over the last decade is there's been a loss of some of those kind of gentlemen's clubs rules that used to happen in Parliament with the rise of hyper-partisanship that you see now. Whereas before there was a possibility to have bipartisanship, members would talk across, government would talk to the opposition, they'd agree in a certain number of things, and only other things went to full debate. And that's disappeared with hyper-partisanship. There's no bipartisanship on any issue, no matter how basic or simple. It just doesn't seem to happen anymore.
They seem to do it better in New Zealand. I don't know why that is. Maybe the smaller population, maybe everyone knows each other.
Well, their new electoral model, of course, also helps force that to happen. Not that I'm a big defender of that happening here, but it does make it more essential that the sides work out working relationships across.
I do hope we can work out a way in our
Which I guess was your
Commonwealth
point.
to get rid of the system whereby a number of apparatchiks, as you describe them, can meet in so-called smoke-filled rooms and gather together these tiny minorities so that the political parties of 1% or less of the population can end up with the balance of power in our national parliament. There's something wrong with that, and that certainly was not what was envisaged in the Constitution, and it should be capable of pretty easy solution.
I think we've got a question, Ingrid.
Ingrid Haythorpe from the Department of Premier and Cabinet. I'd be interested in...
Can't hear.
Ingrid Haythorpe from the
That's
Department
better.
of Premier and Cabinet. I'd be interested in all of your various reflections on the ways in which states can take back some of the power. Jenny, you spoke very accurately about the way the system works, and I know the academic circles often call for CAF to take a more active role, but I think each of you would have something to say about where and when and how the states have successfully taken the fight up to the Commonwealth, because it is a reasonably one-sided game at the moment.
Look, I could get into a fetal position with that question because I used to be Secretary for the Council for the Australian Federation, which is actually the group of premiers. So the premiers meet without the Prime Minister, so it was formed in about 2006. And now I'm a supporter of states. They can be their own worst enemies when it comes to getting a joint consolidated position on a number of things. So part of the thinking behind CAF was that if all the states agreed to something and enacted legislation, then you had a national approach. So you didn't need that kind of relationship you see now with the Commonwealth setting itself up as the big brother to come in and impose a national approach on the states and territories as if they're kind of recalcitrant children. So I still think there's a role for that in Australia, where the states can get together and they can enact mutual legislation or something like that to get a national approach. But it seems very hard to do. So the states tend to, obviously, it's very hard for the states to collaborate at that level and to have to give up something. It's very hard for a Premier to go back after a meeting and say, oh, I gave up this from this particular state so we could have a national approach. It has been tried, and there's some examples of things that work. The initial Garneau report about an ETS was actually commissioned by CAF, and then when Rudd became Prime Minister, because the states didn't believe that John Howard was doing enough about climate change. So they can do it. It's hard for them to do it though.
There's a very good point made, which I never thought of in the CEDA document, which says that in Australia we're probably the only federation with such a small number of component parts that the leaders of government of all of those parts can get into a room and sit around one table. That even in the Swiss Federation there are more component parts, and that we have one of the advantages of not creating more states is that they can all get together, and as in the gun control legislation which Mr Howard pioneered, they can agree that this ought to be done. But I want to bring a reality check in here. If the High Court of Australia says that under the Constitution you have the power, and if you therefore can enact the legislation that taps that source of power, why would you give that power up? And therefore, either if that's the real position we find ourselves in, that can only be resolved by either an explicit amendment of our Constitution, which the people of Australia have been famously reluctant to agree to, under the model of federalism, which makes it difficult to get constitutional changes, or B, the High Court of Australia has to adopt a new approach to the federal idea, and that will involve judges having access to the kind of thinking and knowledge that lawyers don't generally get. I learned a lot of things by reading the CEDA document. And, you know, I have an economics degree and I thought a lot about these things, but a lot of lawyers don't get exposed to that. So we should be thinking about how we can, in our legal process, where constitutionalism is not just about a few words in a very sparse text or a lot of words written by judges over the years, but it's about what we conceive of as the notion of Team Australia and of our country and of the boomerang areas and of the way in which we can involve the people and make decision makers and the spending of money directly accountable to the taxpayers from whom the money is derived.
Well, I can build on that point and come back also to your question. The issue, I guess, comes down to how convincing the argument of subsidiarity can be conveyed. And it's not sufficient for states and territories to simply say, we're going to be better at it than you are, and therefore give us the power. The test of that is whether those to whom that relationship goes on to engage, in other words, the community or whatever section of the community you're talking about, feels convinced that the subsidiarity should be at the state level, not the federal level. And an example that I can recall from my time when I was Minister of State Development, we had South Australia and Victoria, where myself and Robert Fordham from Victoria were pushing the abolition of state preferences by governments for purchases. Previously, up to that point, there was a tolerance that you could allow a South Australian manufacturer to be 10% dearer than the interstate competitors and they'd win the deal. South Australia and Victoria said that doesn't make any sense. It limits South Australian manufacturers to a market of then 1.2 million, now 1.6, and closes them off to the rest of the country. And Victoria had exactly the same viewpoint. In the end, it took 2 years to get that through these ministers' conferences because it just ran against the kind of self-interest at a body politic level at the state level. And at the time, Labor governments were in the majority. We thought that was going to help us get through, but that certainly wasn't the case. Labor governments could be as chauvinist as non-Labor governments. And indeed, it finally got through on the back of Mike Ahern, the National Party Minister of Development in Queensland, under Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen, who got the message that I can convey this subsidiarity principle to my businesses, that they can now get access to a fuller market than previously. And so his vote was the casting vote and brought in the abolition of state preferences back in 1987.
Can I say that when I hear that word subsidiarity, I'm sure it must have come from a German word, probably Untergangenheit, and when I hear it, like most English-speaking people, and certainly like a lot of people in England, as we're seeing in the voting patterns in the United Kingdom, I reach for my scooter to get out of here because it's such an alien word and an alien concept. If we're going to introduce it into the CEDA document, as Terry Moran does, we've got to find a better English word because it's a horrible word and I think it terrifies people, frightens them away.
I'd just like to make a quick comment, which is almost a footnote to some of the cases that you referred to, Michael. It's about a case, a 1908 case, and it reflects really the importance of the themes that you've been talking about judicial interpretation and the role of the High Court in defining Commonwealth-federal relationship. But in 1908 there was a decision which no doubt you'd be familiar with, the surplus revenue case, and that concerned...
I think about very little else.
So it turns on section, I think it's 94 of the Commonwealth Constitution, which provided, where the framers provided that wherever the Commonwealth collected more revenue than was required to run its business, then that would be returned month by month to the states. So the framers seem to have a relatively clear model in their heads about how that financial relationship was going to operate. But in 1908, the High Court held that the Commonwealth could validly hive off money from the consolidated account. The surplus revenue could be pushed off into trust funds or accounts outside consolidated account so that it was no longer surplus. It was being used over here in a bank account, and therefore it didn't need to be returned to the state. So from that, really the whole edifice of state-Commonwealth financial relations is built, and it's just sort of fascinating to think if that decision had gone the other way, what a different federation we may well have today.
Can I just add a footnote to your footnote?
Please.
And that is, in the Work Choices case, Justice Callanan and I dissented. He dissented because he was an originalist. He said this is not how the original founders conceived that our constitution would operate in industrial relations matters. They considered it should be dealt with under 5135, and therefore that's how it should remain. I never accepted that view of the Constitution because that freezes in time our Constitution and traps it in the minds and thinking of all those men, and as Lynn pointed out, they're all men of the 1890s who drafted it. So that wouldn't work for me, but my view was the grant of power to the Federal Parliament is subject to this Constitution, and that requires that you look at the Constitution as it is intended to operate today and as a whole. And it's a federal Constitution. And it's a federal Constitution that gives certain powers to the Federal Parliament, and you've got to understand those powers in the context of retaining a viable federal Constitution. And then you're back to the original approach of the original justices of how you construe the Constitution. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the approach which the High Court has unanimously and repeatedly, including myself, said is the proper approach to the construction of legislation. And constitutions are a special legislation, but they're still legislation. You don't take a word out of context. You have to see it and understand it as we do in ordinary speech, in its meaning in the context in which it's used. And that is what we've turned our back on in the engineers case, and it's very interesting to read the two Williams cases and to see that maybe at last, in reaction to where engineers has taken us in our Australian Federation, the High Court is beginning to say, but you can't, just by the executive power, do things outside the areas that have been granted to the Federal Parliament as specific matters. You've got to find a federal source of it. And I think that's a very good reversion to the original approach, which is the modern approach of construing statutes. And there's now a disharmony between that approach to construing all other statutes and the approach of construing the Constitution, which is basically locked into Justice Isaacs's view, which is derived from the Privy Council of 1903.
I think we may be out of time, so I'll hand back to Hamilton.